The Jasta 65 project started as an attempt to recreate this iconic photograph. When I started modeling again a couple years ago, I realized that this was my thing, as I like to try to recreate photographs. And in doing so, I also realized that the way that most modelers are presenting their builds, step-by-step pictures and sort of a methodical plotting build log, I found that to be kind of boring and uninteresting. So the idea occurred to me that I would try to tell a story of the airplanes being built, and I wanted to do something differently with the scale modeling. So I started to try to tell the story of Jasta 65. That was the unit that the 7 Savians plane was part of. In doing so, I kind of got just deep into this history of these men, and what turned into a way to sort of document a build sort of turned into a giant storyboard project. And I realized the deeper I went that the images were telling a story. And so when I first started to research the pilots, like a lot of us do, we'll do some research into the men, and as it turns out, there's only 4 planes that are part of history. And originally this 7 Sabians plane was mistakenly identified to a guy named Schutzel. As it turns out, it's Bader. And the deeper I got into this story, the more fascinating it became. And as it turns out that Otto Wiesenhaar, one of the pilots, he had his picture book destroyed by the U.S. Army. And as it turns out, in World War II, I think he was maybe a transport pilot. But anyway, the military police were interrogating him, and the story goes that they were ripping up his photos in front of him, and he was howling and crying. And I got to thinking about what that photograph book would be, and it would have been him starting in the aircraft factory. And it wasn't a conscious decision. It was just my trying to document my build, and I found myself telling the story. And you can see that the idea of the factory was kind of crudely executed, just some leaning up plywood. But I felt like I was doing something unique, and in trying to make the showing of the build process more interesting, the story began to unfold. And as I researched these pilots, Bader started as a mechanic. He was assigned, and these guys as the pilots, as the crews in the field, the German air mechanics and pilots would be lost through attrition and war and die. Guys from the factory would be reassigned to field units. So it started off in, sort of a factory setting, building these, and it gave me an opportunity to show some of my previous builds. And I also realized that I'm not a particularly, I'm not a super skilled modelist. I guess I'm a quantity over quality guy. And I realized that my builds were kind of crude and my painting was kind of crude. but that I had a good eye for setting, and on each of these builds I was learning. And so I decided, the Fokker, as they was issued from the factory, they would be basically sent to the front lines like this, without the wings, with the factory markings. And so through the course of 8 different Facebook posts, I told the story of the mechanics in the Fokker factory and the pilots being assigned to their forward airbase in France. And I think the vast majority of modelers and people just kind of didn't get what I was doing. They would just see these different photos. So this is the aircraft being transported from the factory to the field. And this is pretty much how it would have been done. And they would be field assembled. I use filters and stuff to kind of get the old-timey look. And it's interesting that the model company, Aviattic, that built this lorry, they, for a second, one of the designers thought this was a real photo, which was, of course, the ultimate compliment. So I started to imagine, these guys are now in a forward airfield, and the local kid would, like kids do, would come around and snoop around. And so one of the things about the German airplanes is a lot of times in the photographs you'll see them with a teddy bear as a mascot. So I got thinking about, nowhere was there a story of how that would happen. So I imagined this boy coming around. He's got a teddy bear, and the crew and the pilots, of course, as people do, are kind to the kid, and they let him get up in the airplane and trade him his teddy bear for their mock-up of an airplane they use for flight training. So throughout the project, I had a chance to kind of do my thing of recreating photographs using green screen. This is the top is my airplane. It's one airplane multiplied through computer with the lorry behind it, placed in grass. I could never get it exactly, but I get it pretty close. And were I to spend a lot more time, I could balance out the picture with filtering. But I began to kind of get the feeling like I was getting to know these guys really well. And I imagined this boy getting to know the different pilots and how they would train the pilots. And I could imagine that, I think it was 9 of the pilots of Jasta 65 died in combat. So he would have got to know them, and they would have slowly begun to disappear through combat. And one of the things about Jasta 65 is they just said, well, whoever was doing his planes was a very talented artist. So I started imagining the artist that would paint the planes, and he too would be getting to know these pilots and decorating their planes and then having them die one by one. So I imagined him as a heavy drinker with post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe. And so he's got a bottle in his hand, and I've been blessed. So I was able to pick up a set of 3 Wingnut Wings Fokker D7s, and once I realized what I was doing, I was just all in and wanting to do it, and tell the story as best I could. And so this chapter was called The Artist, and basically showing the second of the 3 planes that I built in the context of a man who decorates the planes, sees these pilots go up and not come back, and how that might have affected him. Perhaps one of his comrades is telling him to not take it so hard, that that's just part of part of the deal. And some people were starting to catch on what I was doing. They would see the recreation of certain photographs, and there's the purists out there. There's guys that are super talented that are like, you're kind of a hack modeler, but I like what you're doing. And there's other people that just straight up didn't get it, like never would look at all the pictures. But then you always got the some that make it all the way through, and they let you know by liking the last photo in any of the chapters. And one of the motivations for this project was that I found that I could not build a Wingnut Wing model kit right the first time. It's like, other guys, they've got the chops, but for me, like, to learn one of these kits, I have to do it more than once. So at this point now, Jasta 65 is suffering attrition. They are being moved to a different airbase in Marville, France. All this happened. This is oil painting with my model and characters. The lorry trucks replicated in green screen. And, again, trying to show how I do things, but not having it be some sterile, boring, step-by-step process. At this point, the pilots and the factory in Berlin where the propellers made actually got bombed. So I imagined a scenario where these guys would have to make their own in the field, and was able to make that part of the story, and got better at building propellers. And, again, reoccurring characters and trying to basically capturing the capture as part of the storytelling. And at that point, oops, I gotta go back. So at this point, I was pretty fully committed to the story. And I'm showing these guys on patrol. And, obviously there's a string hanging that one. So different things. Sometimes I'd use green screen. Sometimes it's the airplane itself from a string over a poster, over some grass. And, you filter that stuff out. I got a poster of Naples, Italy that I used as a backdrop. And definitely a struggle towards the end of this, I started to kind of get burned out, I guess, and so there's a couple percentage points on every model that's not quite finished, and that's this chapter was called A Close Call because the only picture of this aircraft looks like this. It's upside down in a field, and you can see the shadow of the photographer. So I imagined that scenario where he's out on patrol, crashes his plane. Nobody really knows why. But the hand-carved wood propellers, definitely a beautiful thing and a fun process. Not that hard to do. It usually will take a couple tries. I make 2 or 3 at a time and pick the best one. And so the World War Ones, they had mobile bases, air bases, and they would move around. So that's trying to show these guys in transit. This is a green screen. These past builds dropped into pictures that I would just pull off the internet. And, some are better than others. What I'm ultimately going for, I think, is a vibe. And it's kind of funny, people really know their history. And so somebody's like, that's England. I'm like, well, sorry, I didn't know that. It's airfield, big grassy park somewhere in Europe. It turns out that's England, not France. My bad. So, a chance to show the last of the engines, the one that I detailed the most. And instead of just showing it on a white screen, making it part of the story of, these guys sitting around after hours shooting the breeze with the engine. Maybe they're talking about different maintenance tricks or tips, instruction, whatever. And I found myself naming some of these guys, like Jurgen and a couple different guys. So in the Facebook posts, at some point, I signed some of these guys' names because they're reoccurring characters. So I started to get a lot of appreciation. And the thing about the Facebook that's cool is you can see that you have a global audience, a small but global audience. So, and that there's people that are in Japan and Europe and different parts of the world that are seeing your work. And last time I looked, something like 100,000 people had looked at this. So that's one of the advantages of the internet, is that you can create art and expose it to a global audience at the speed of light. And it's just a wonderful time to be alive, to be doing art of any kind. So then what I thought was the last project was the Seven Sabians plane. And so for that, I built this hangar. I'm going to do a video about that hangar. It's pretty cool. I thought that this would be the best of the three as I built it last. It had all the aftermarkets. As it turned out, it's probably the worst of the three builds because of the aftermarkets having their own, things, difficulties, that, like the radiator didn't fit very well. The cowling actually, that cowling would fit better if I glued it on, but it's able to come off. And this radiator's a 3D printed radiator you can see through. I had kind of botched these decals and had to redo it. So, some guys would definitely fault me on this loose fit, but again, this comes off here. So if I were to glue it, it would fit much tighter. The Wingnut Wings kits are a treat. Some of it's really tricky. I mean, old decals, but I realize now that this was all kind of unintentional, and I was just kind of vamping on this whole idea. And as it went on, I realized I kind of want to go back and maybe properly caption the story of this picture with this, with a prose. And as they were interrogating Otto Wiesenhaar, they were ripping up his photos one by one and throwing them into the fire. So maybe they would have been asking him to explain each photo. So this is cool. This is the actual small town of Marville, France, that these guys would have flown over. I pulled from Wikipedia. And Jasta 65 did engage with the 99th Aero Squadron. They shot down some balloons and one particular plane. This is a plane from the 99th Aero Squadron. It's a Salmson two-seater. Just a great air model to build. These are little bullet patches. And the story goes that they shot down this plane. The pilot was killed. The observer survived. So altogether, there's 4 models plus the lorry, something like 183 scenes. And the final chapter I found to be touching for me. Like, they shot down that plane and they recovered the body of the pilot. And the story goes that actually they both died. So I went with that. And this is the crew of the men of Jasta 65 burying the 2 fallen guys from the 99th Aero Squadron. And pilot and the commandant, the artist, they're sharing a drink. And after it, the boy comes along. Back to the boy. he comes up to the grave, and he's realizing how many of these friends that he's lost. So he smashes the toy airplane at the grave of these pilots, and he walks away. I didn't realize, at the time what an anti-war story that it was. And then it occurred to me that I think all war stories are anti-war in their core, because despite the glamour and the illusion of glory, really ultimately this is kind of what war is all about, is the grave. And the men who go to the grave and the men who send them to the grave all have a completely different experience about war. So thanks for watching. I hope that people enjoyed that whole project, and I think I'm going to finish it by showing the MP story and what they did. Thanks again.